Sir Thomas More,
Oops,
and it would of course be...
Let me get fired up here. Okay? Oops.
Dude, now I lose my line. Okay, you all have this this little paper there, right? Everybody got one? Okay, and I will stick to it so that you have something to carry home later on, and then you can somehow, read over what we said here. And as we go on, you can make little notes there if you want to, and if you add something or say something else than what is in here. So that helps a little bit to remember for the next time then. Okay, I wanted to have a lecture reading before each of our lectures from the book of Revelation, but unfortunately I haven't brought my Bible with me, so we will do that the next time. It says here that this is the 86th discourse, or we had 86 discourses at Thomas More through the years. That means from 1965 on. And let me explain why I did. In every semester since 1965, I had meeting, and sometimes we had a lot of people, and sometimes we had a few people. But I did it anyway, no matter how many people there were. And the reason for that, and that was every semester there's 6 lectures, so that is a lot, 86 times 6 or so, it's a lot of talking. And the reason for that is that during the German experience, many Catholics, particularly afterwards, said that they had not been informed about what a liberal society is and what a fascist society is and what a socialist society is. And that therefore, when it came, they fell into those temptations, and that was really the fault of the Church, because the Church should have taught them what it was all about, the transition from the liberal German society, which was called the Weimar Republic, over into a fascist type of a system. And then maybe also from a fascist system again, over into a liberal society or civil society. That's the society we are living in. That's our type of society. So, well, at that time, so very early on in the 50s already, I made up my mind. I cannot say I take an oath because I'm against taking oath, because the New Testament says, the old people said you should keep your oath. I tell you, don't take any oaths. Say yes, yes, no, no. And what is more than that is from the evil one. It is satanic. President Obama just put his hand on the Bible of Lincoln and took an oath on the same Bible which says that it is satanic. It did something satanic. This is a Christian country. So this is all over the place, these contradictions. So nevertheless, I thought, or made up my mind, that I would like to do everything in order to inform people about, particularly in Christians or in Catholic parishes like this one, to tell them something about the context in which they read their religious texts. And so that is why I did this during times of crisis in the 60s and 70s, but also when it seemed to be a little bit quieter, and during the wars which we had, of course, I always addressed then these particular issues, but the fundamental thing was always to inform people about their consciousness about what was going on, where they were living at this time, and if they were believers or non-believers, because they were believers sometimes and they were non-believers too, that believers and non-believers know the context in which they are. And the context is a transition period. And this makes people so insecure. And we are now in a very dramatic type of a transition period. And you can see this, and we want to have contemporary issues here too. So anything what you can take out. Yesterday, the president, today again, President Obama said that what the people did, the leaders of Wall Street, that this was shameless and so on, that they gave themselves 20 billion bonuses and already 2 years ago as they were going into this crisis, and now again in this crisis and so on. So he was very angry, and there's people who are guilty of Wall Street, they came up and they whispered something that they deserved that was their income, and that in order to keep those great geniuses who produced the whole mess. In order to keep those great geniuses, one had to pay more for them, otherwise they would leave and would go to another company which is as bankrupt as they are, and so on. So, but when you analyze this in detail now, what that means, why the president was so upset was that they are bailed out by billions and billions, hundreds of billions of dollars. And while they are bailed out, they give themselves those bonuses. But that is, when you look a little bit deeper now, and that is what we want to try to do in our discourse. Of course, the bailout is a euphemism for federalization. That means wherever the federal government gives something to a bank or to a corporation, it buys it up to that extent. So they all know what is coming and is going on is nationalization and federalization. And therefore, they try to rob as much as possible as long as this has not yet happened, because after it has happened, then they will not have the chance to do that. Either they will be replaced, they will be fired, that is one possibility, that's what Europe does all over the place, or they will stay in, but then there will be a federal government like it was in the Second World War, and that federal government will dictate to them what they have to do. Or they will be replaced by federal functionaries and will disappear completely. So in the face of this, they take these $20 billion they took on Wall Street for bonuses. So therefore, they are maybe the ones who know clearest that we are in a transition. Because I think the masses of Americans think that this is just a business cycle, like so many other cycles. The first business cycle we had was in 1827, the first depression, which shocked suddenly England, and all these problems which we have now appeared the first time. And so this, what people still believe is that maybe after a short time of these rough methods like federalization and so on, that we will return to the free market. But that is not the case. That means we are at the end of a period. That means a big period, what was called modernity. Since 1917, we have moved away from modernity. And modernity means civil society. And modernity means bourgeois society. And modernity means capitalistic society. That means, since quite some time, the capitalistic system was, of course, in crisis, but now it comes to its end. This is such a sharp learning curve that people are not really up to it. The only ones who know this instinctively is the ones who just gave themselves $20 billion bonuses, because in order to secure themselves when this thing becomes clear to everybody. Now, it looks that even the Roosevelt liberalism of Obama may mean that he believes that one can, after 2 or 3 years of stabilization, one could maybe return again to a free market or whatever. But then if he thinks that, then he also suffers, of course, of an illusion, because if we would then deregulate again, or he would reduce the policing of civil society by the state, again, then he would glide into even a deeper depression than we do already now, where you have 160,000 people letting go. My daughter just wrote to me, she lost her job as a lawyer in New York and so on. So one after the other in my family and so on, from the West Coast to the East Coast and so on. So it's all over. So the sooner we see that a whole period or a whole epoch, what was called modernity, which lasted 400 years, and the rule of the bourgeoisie are coming to its end. The question is now if that can be non-violently, if that can be done peacefully, or if it becomes traumatic, and that would be very sad. And the better, the higher the level of education is, that means the better we know what transition period we are in, the greater is the chance that it can be done non-violently. That means that the tremendous anger of 180 million workers in this country who are deprived of their work, of their pension, sometimes of their houses and so on. You hear yesterday a man killed his wife and 5 children because he lost his job and so on. So when that hits, when you have this children responsibility and you cannot feed your children adequately anymore, then people are driven against the wall and they do very, very extreme things. So and if that happens to millions and millions of people, it is possible that they get all angry together. And the question is then where this anger is directed. And there is in all television stations, there is now anger slowly directed to the Wall Street people, but it is not really precise yet, namely against the corporate ruling class. Not against Bush, who was a little functionary clown who did their job for 8 years or whatever. But that what is behind them is this, the banking and the corporations. So the corporate ruling class of America, to some extent it is not only national, but it is international as well. So this is the focus point. And if people don't have the real focus point for their aggression, they turn their aggression against themselves. In terms of suicide, even if the army yesterday, there was a report about so many people, soldiers who commit suicide already in the field because of stress. But then most of them, when they come home and suddenly find themselves here in the situation and ask, why the hell have I fought and have no job and street people and so on and so on. So that is the crisis in which we are. And that we want to connect here with a man who lived in another transition period, and that is Thomas More. So it is not only because he's the patron saint of this church, and I don't even know how he got into this position. I came maybe 2 or 3 years after this church was built, and at that time there was the priest Father Taylor, who has died in the meantime. And maybe Father Taylor, I want to explore this. Who was this smart fellow who gave this name to this church and why? And if he really knew what he did, because Thomas More is a very complex and does not fit into the very conservative atmosphere of Michigan and the very conservative atmosphere of the church in Michigan. And therefore I did the whole course on Thomas More, but I think otherwise people never talk about him very much. He's just sitting in this church here as a patron saint, but nobody remembers him. So and that's what we want to do, and he lived in another transition period, namely the transition period from feudalism to capitalism. So he is at the beginning of the period which is now coming to its end. But that is not the decisive thing. The decisive thing is that while he was at the beginning of the bourgeois and the capitalistic period, that he developed in his Utopia, and that is the book we want to have here, he developed what a good human society ought to be. So this is what a utopia is. It means uk topos, no place. But that doesn't say very much. In reality, what the utopia does, it presents a society with what is the case, something as it ought to be, and opposes that. So this utopia then becomes a critique of the society which exists. And it's interesting then that when you have on one side secular people, like the Marxists, like Karl Kautsky, for instance, and on the other side you have Catholic thinkers, then the Catholics think that Thomas More wanted to restore the great Catholic feudal age again. And Kautsky, the socialist, would say no, that his utopia is really turned against all class systems. That means against the medieval class system, against the modern class system, which was just developing. And this is an unusual type. That means that this genius of Thomas wrote a book which was critical of an order with kings and noblemen and so on, which was decadent, which was dying, and that at the same time he was already critical of the new class order which came, and anticipated its end. And so he is a man of all seasons, as it says in the movie. So he is a man of this first transition, but he is at the same time also a man for the present transition, and that is why we want to read him, because we need help in terms of not only what is now decadent and which goes under. So when Obama says, you know, this is irresponsible, this is shameful, these are all understatements. These are all understatements. I mean, these are very harmless type of statements about what this ruling class in this country is all about and its decadence and so on. So it is one thing to say, you know, that this capitalistic order is now going down the drain, but it's something else now, and that's what so many people are afraid of, what is supposed to replace it. And so Thomas More can, in his Utopia, tell us certain things, how this or what could replace that. It is not so now, you know, that one could say, let's take this book now and go to the Democratic Party and then make laws and whatever. So it is not that simple. You cannot, you know, be a nice, wonderful teacher and teach the world what it should do next. But it is rather so that the world is doing what it is doing. And you saw that with this tragic case of President Bush, who in the last half year of his regime did the exact opposite what he always wanted to do. And he was even honest enough, which was unusual, honest enough to say that. He said, I'm doing something which I don't want to do. That means he began to federalize. That means he began to introduce a new system, federalization and so on. And when he did it, they didn't call it socialism. But when Obama did it, then they called it socialism. And so we have to see what truth, we don't want to hang on labels or concepts or so. But what I want to say is there is a subjective side, subjective consciousness in us, but there is something objective going on. The idiotic thing which we talk about camp is about constructing reality or whatever. Well, to some extent we do construct something, but you know, we construct the law of gravity. But besides that construction, there is a real law of gravity which you can try out by jumping from a roof. And then you have it really, and no matter what we construct, if I had this wonderful discussion there with my friend Ivan Supek, the quantum physicist from the Heisenberg School, and one day he said, well, just write on the blackboard now what the dialectical notion of gravity is. And so I did, and then he said, well, now I tell you what quantum physics has to say about this, and Einstein and so on. And certainly painted full all these blackboards full of quantity with little things, 1 + 2, A up there, and so on and so on. And it went on for hours and hours. Well, both of them were constructs, of course, human concepts. But there is something else than these concepts, namely the real movement in nature of space and time and causation and so on. And so therefore there is a real movement. That means the capitalistic movement of capitalism comes to its end, no matter if we want it or don't want it, or if we hate it or love it or whatever, it doesn't matter at all. So, but what we can do, and where this book can help, is not to prescribe how it ought to be or whatever, but rather to understand what is going on and then cooperate with it or resist it or whatever. So it will enlighten us about movements which take place without our likes or dislikes or whatever. So now we have to say a little bit. I have certain talking points there in the end, so we can proceed in an orderly way. But let me just say a few things how he is situated there in this. But maybe I stick a little bit more to this, because otherwise you cannot trace it later on. So what I just said was the reason why I did so many of these lectures in the last 40 years or so. We have a real established tradition there, and this is the 87th discourse whom we have here, and we wanted to start with the book of Revelation. We'll do that the next time. We are concerned with the future. Here we shall approach Thomas More's Utopia in an eschatological horizon, so that is our presupposition. And now the topic of this course, this time we have decided with the pastoral team here to discuss the topic of St. Thomas More Utopia and American Politics 2009. I gave another alternative which is interesting. I gave them always two options, and the other option was guilt, repentance, and atonement. But they rejected this, and it was foreseeable that it would be rejected. And there is, of course, something behind that. We, in the last 8 years, you know, that this nation was involved in horrible issues. I mean, I mentioned just Guantanamo Bay, or torture and outsourcing of torture, innumerable international crimes, crimes against our own constitution, crimes against international law and the Geneva Conventions, and so on. And so also we, the Christians, Catholics and evangelicals, millions of them voted for this administration twice against their own faith position. They could just have asked or read in the New Testament, "By their fruits you will know them," and which is the only functionalistic sentence in the New Testament, and had looked at the fruits of this administration, and they would at least not have voted a second time or so, but they did vote a second time. And here you see again what I said before, why I made that oath for myself, to tell people what is going on, or particularly church people or so. It failed. That means it happened again here to millions of Catholics and evangelicals, that they fell into a moral catastrophe. It was a moral catastrophe when millions of Catholics went along with the National Socialist, the Fascist Society, and it was again a moral catastrophe when particularly the second time, but when Christians voted for this administration. In spite of the fact that they knew that there were already 150 people killed in Texas, in the prisons and so on. The president read for 5 minutes, he read the reports, and then he okayed it, and they were executed. And that one woman who had found Christ asked for pardon, and he made jokes about her, and on television the next day she was executed. If one knows something like this, then one has to be very careful to move such a man from a lower into a higher power position where he can kill even more of them, and so he did. And so then after the first, then the second, things people should at least have known, but again, the second election there was again millions of Catholics and evangelicals who did the same thing. And so is there real repentance now? You know, the vote yesterday of the Republicans against this stimulus package and so on shows that Obama won, and he says it, tells it everybody that he won, but there is another strong masses and masses of people who have not really seen that something very horrible went on the last 8 years. So therefore I think that particularly in the churches it would be the time, where else would be the time to reflect on this and say, what in God's name have we done? We have killed over 1 million people in another country, and we must say we, because I pay taxes, and with these taxes that war was done. So none of us, if we now voted or not, none of us can say I'm innocent, and can then stand against others and can say you are the guys who did this, and so on, because we all did it. If I had withdrawn my taxes and put them on an account or whatnot, paid taxes, and you know, whatever the weapons cost, then it would be a little bit different stories. But in reality, we are all in this guilt connection, and so it would be the task of rabbis and of mullahs here in this country, and of priests and ministers and so on, to tell people, if we want to really have a good start, a new start, then we have to deal with this guilt connection into which we have worked ourselves, because otherwise it will fall into our back and the new will not be so new. So, but it is not done. It's just not done. Why that is so, and if it is nationalism, for instance, right or wrong, my country cannot do anything wrong. If others had done the same thing, we would know that it's wrong. But since we have done it, it cannot be wrong, because my country cannot be wrong. That may be one thing and so on, but if we do not really liberate ourselves from that horror in which we were involved, then it will not be possible to do something new. And in a specific way, what will come up, a question which will come up, and it is glimmering through here and there, what to do with this administration now who did all these crimes. We know what we ought to do. If we had the courage, we would send them all to Den Haag. But if we don't have that courage, the second thing is we could have an impeachment process here at home. We could have a trial here at home. But what people say is, now let's get that behind us and let's go forward into the future, as if one could make this magic thing and cut this simply and say, now that's the past and it's all over and so on. It's not over. If the only purpose of punishment, the only realistic, non-magical, non-metaphysical type of punishment is that one wants to prevent that this will happen again. And so if we let that go and the guy goes to Texas down into dollars and goes to football games or whatever and celebrates his old age or whatever, while he leaves behind this unbelievable catastrophe, not only economically but militarily and so on, then what will prevent that 4 years or 8 years from now somebody will take that as a precedence and say, well, he did it, he got away with it, so why should I do this, and so on. So we have to do something, you know, and the church's thing would be, it's not their task now to go to Den Haag or to have a trial or whatever, but at least in the churches one should ask, you know, reflect on the horrible crimes which have been committed in the name of all of us, and therefore then to repent. And that repentance then will give us a new beginning, a new chance. So I mean, for my German example, you know, I don't think the Germans ever repented the Second World War, or that they killed 27 million Russians, or that they killed 6 million Jews or so. They paid reparations, that's true, but they paid, you know, not to Israel, billions and billions of marks they paid to Israel and so on. But I have the feeling that this happened very much on the surface. And there is the great psychoanalyst Michelin, both husband and wife, who have concentrated on this study, that the Germans didn't have this ability to mourn, the ability to go through this sadness about all what has happened. And if so, while they give, you know, on the surface and do all these things and pay, they did pay a lot and so on, it does not really touch them deep down in their heart, where they think we were right after all, and so on. And so then, under those circumstances, no new things can happen. Okay, so now what does it mean in detail and so on? This, you know, this what we have there, Thomas More and Utopia. I explained a little bit what Utopia means, and I explained a little bit also what American politics is like by just quoting the president. First, we want to deal with the life story of Thomas More a little bit. Who was he, and so on. So we can just do this, maybe you know already something about him. He was the Lord Chancellor of Henry VIII. And he was born, you know, in the beginning of the 16th century, and he was executed in the middle of the century in the Tower. And he came from a middle-class type of a family. For some time he went to a monastery in England, and I think he played with the thought maybe to become a monk or to become a priest, and but he gave that up and then became a lawyer and worked himself up in the court and was a judge before he became the Lord Chancellor. Henry VIII is, of course, the great partner in his life. Who was Henry VIII? He was became king very young. He was a humanist. And what is a humanist? Well, the greatest of the humanists at that time was Erasmus of Rotterdam. Who was Erasmus of Rotterdam? He was the son of a priest, the illegitimate son of a priest in Holland. And he was in the service. He was first in an order. He was a member of a religious order. He got freed from that order. He didn't want to be in the order anymore. So then he became a secular priest and the chancellor of a bishop in Rotterdam, and then began to study Latin and to Greek, and he began to translate the Greek New Testament, and became reawakened again the Greek past and the Roman past, and on this basis was able then to read the New Testament again, and he could have become Luther. It is quite a big question why Erasmus did not become Luther. And one reason may be that he was a very tender little soul, and he was very much concerned with the health of his little body, and he didn't have that bull type of a nature which Luther had. He hated turmoil, so when it got loud, he left the scene and went into his little study, and that's where he was happy and peaceful and so on. So I think he was not martyr material, because Luther's life was of course always threatened because of what he had done. When Charles V died in Valladolid in Spain, he said, "I should have killed him, I should have killed Luther. He destroyed my church and he destroyed my empire." That shows you the unbelievable hate against Luther, and Luther came out of the bushes, East Germany, that was really the jungle, that was not really civilized territory, that was not Paris or whatever, and therefore Luther had no idea about Thomas Aquinas, and therefore charged the church with things which the church had never taught really. So, but if Erasmus, people looked for Erasmus as the real reformer. He was supposed to rescue the church and free the church from all that stupidity and foolishness and decadence and so on. But it was finally Luther who did the step. So when we see Thomas More, we have to look at his king. We have to look at Erasmus. Thomas More met Erasmus, was very much fascinated by his work, and imitated him to a large extent in England. There were continual contacts between the two. But also the same thing is true for Charles VIII, Henry VIII. Henry VIII, studied Latin. He could speak Latin. He spoke with the daughter Margaret, who was the most beloved daughter of Thomas More, in Latin and so on. He could make songs. He had written a book in defense of the Roman Catholic Church just a few years earlier, and the Pope had praised him and called him the defender of the faith, defender fidei, and so everything seemed to be all right. And the humanists, Erasmus and More, had great hopes about Henry VIII, that he would be that ideal king they looked for, but right away he got involved in wars in Holland, and that was a disappointment. But the real disappointment was still waiting for them, and we could not understand the life of Thomas More without a relationship to Henry VIII and also to Erasmus and so on. So there was no relationship to Luther as such but there was some sympathy. What they all had in common, Luther and Calvin, and this is Protestant territory here, they had something in common in that sense that they knew that something was deeply wrong with the feudal church. Like we today, we know that something is deeply wrong with the bourgeois church downtown, and not only the Catholic, the Protestant, and so on. So the same way they knew at that time that something was deeply wrong with the feudal church, that it had departed from Jesus. And the program of the humanists was ad fontem. That means go to the source again. So they went again what they hadn't done for decades or centuries, and read the New Testament and confronted the New Testament to the church as it existed, this feudal church. Or today, this bourgeois church, which has just voted for this administration twice. I mean, this is, about shameless or whatever. So this was the situation, and they had all that in common. But how that had to be done that there they differed. Okay, so there was another fellow, Thomas Münzer, played a role at that time. And Thomas Münzer and Erasmus have something in common as far as their afterlife is concerned. I mean the afterlife on this earth, not in heaven. But they were both somehow repressed. That means Thomas Münzer, Protestant and Catholics didn't talk about him for centuries. It was then Friedrich Engels, the Marxist, who wrote the first book about Thomas Münzer 300 years later. And then it was Bloch in this century who wrote a little book about him. So that means Thomas Münzer, why did they repress him? And the same thing was also with Erasmus. It was Karl Kautsky, the Social Democrat in Germany, who wrote an important book about him in the 19th and 20th century. So why, does that happen? There must be something dangerous about this. So Thomas Münzer was also with Luther in Wittenberg, and I visited with my friend Mike Ott there 2 or 3 years ago. We went there 2 years ago, I think. And so they were both together in Wittenberg. They were both reformers. And then suddenly Thomas Münzer applied the Gospels, the New Testament, the Sermon on the Mount, to the social situation of his time, and particularly to the farmers. So he participated in the farmers' rebellion against the feudal lords. What I said before, with the 180 million American workers rising against the ruling class who have exploited them, and after stealing their surplus value for 200 years, they even want them, these workers, as taxpayers to bail them out on top and then give themselves bonuses and so on. I mean, how more horrible can the situation be? But here you have the struggle, the antagonism between 180 million workers and a small ruling class of about 1 million people. At that time, you had the feudal lords on one side, and then you had the thousands and 10,000s of serfs who did their job and produced their wealth. And so Thomas Münzer put himself at the head. He made himself available to farmers who suffered from this oppression and exploitation. And it went even to very intimate things like the right of the prime noctis, the lex prime noctis, the right of the first night. The feudal lords for 1,000 years slept with their farmers' brides in the wedding night, so that the first child, very often of every marriage, was the feudal lord's child. And that went on up to 1917, which I gave as a number for the beginning of the postmodern age. So in 1917, a chaplain in the suburb of Vienna was still thrown out of office because he criticized that lex talionis. At the same time, in the Habsburg were thrown out, really. So it was really the end, of the beginning of the end of the bourgeoisie, but long the end of the feudal lords, and they still have that law. So, but it was also fishing rights and hunting rights and so on. And so the Thomas Münzer had a very wonderful rhetoric ability, charisma. He could speak to these farmers, and so he organized them. And first Luther was with him. Luther said, Thomas Münzer has a right to speak, there should be freedom of speech, and so on. But then somehow Luther heard about cruelties which the farmers had committed. And so Luther turned around then and turned against Thomas Münzer. And Luther also wrote a horrible book against the farmers. It was at that point when Luther lost a lot of his popularity in Germany as soon as he turned against the farmers. But Thomas Münzer did not, so he led them, and Charles V called his troops from Italy under General Frundsberg. These were new troops who were not armed anymore, didn't carry any armor any longer, but they they were able to crawl under the feudal lords horses and stabbed them so that they broke down, and then the armored knight could not lift himself up again. You needed a crane to pull him up and put him on the horse again, so they stabbed him too. So it was a qualitative jump in the dialectics of weaponry, as we have, for instance, battleships get so big that they cannot maneuver anymore, or tanks get so much armored that they cannot move fast enough anymore. So then you have a dialectical movement in weaponry, and that had happened. So Charles V called these troops from Italy, and they then went against the farmers. Thomas Münzer had trained them in Mühlhausen in Thuringia, and but they couldn't stand up against them. So they were overrun, and 100,000 farmers were killed in one summer, in the summer 1525. And so that Thomas Münzer was tortured, and then he was decapitated, and his head was put on Mühlhausen on the walls. He had been a priest, and he had married, and as many of them did at that time, and so he had 2 children. Nobody knows where the wife and the 2 children, where they got lost in the whole process. So that means now when you do a revolution and you lose the revolution, of course then things get worse afterwards. And so the farmers in Germany, these were the idiots of the society. Usually they were shown, you know, with a little thing on, what people wear when the farmers, when they sleep, they had some kind of a little cap there on their heads, and so he was portrayed for 400 years and looked down on, and so on. That is the result when you lose a revolution. So now the Marxists would say that Thomas Münzer was a bourgeois revolutionary, but that is not true. The bourgeoisie did not go with Münzer. They went with Calvin and so on, with the Protestant right. So the Thomas Münzer was an anticipation of, not of the bourgeoisie, the 400 years, but an anticipation of something which was still very distant, namely the socialistic type of Napoleon, namely the rise of the workers, not of the bourgeoisie. And that is the same thing which is true also for our friend here, Thomas More. He is not the initiator of the bourgeois revolution or whatever, but he belongs into the socialistic camp. That means he was very lonely, because both of them were very lonely, because they stood up for a class of people who were not in line yet for changing for a revolutionary step. So these people, these groups of people, we have to keep in mind when we want to look at Thomas More. That means Henry VIII and Erasmus and Thomas Münzer and Martin Luther. And the more and the better we know them, the better we will understand the work, and the texts are best understood in the context and the goals which they all shared at this time. Our main concern is to see Thomas More in this context of the transition period, and that he therefore can help us now in the present situation in which we are. Let me stop here for a moment and see if there are any questions about what because I'm not entirely clear how far these different people are known, or, you know. I wrote my dissertation about Michael Helding, who was also an Erasmian, but he remained Catholic and became a bishop, and was a bishop of Merseburg in East Germany, and was also in the Supreme Court of Charles V, and a very tragic figure because his relatives, he was the only German bishop out of farmer background, and his relatives were all butchered in 1525. But it took me a long time when I wrote the dissertation, what an unbelievable thing that is, that somebody belongs to a group which is almost annihilated, and he survives and serves the men who did the annihilating. And I wrote that under a fascist professor, Professor Joseph Lorz, and we didn't get along then, when we got to the farmers and to this whole thing there, to new evaluation of Thomas Münzer, what his role was, and so on. So, so we could. There was no connection between Thomas More and this Helding fellow. He was just in Germany. He was also the first bishop who went to first German bishop who went to the Council of Trent. The Pope called in the council in order to react against Luther, and the German bishops did not come. But Helding did go, but was horribly angry about the behavior of the Pope. At that time, they introduced, they canceled the celibate for 2 years, 3 years. They also introduced the chalice for the lay people, which took another 400 years until it finally got through with the Second Vatican Council, and now lay people can get the chalice, but you have to think that this for 400 years that was repressed. And what will happen to celibacy, we don't know. There was not even a new beginning now, even after the council, except the deacons. The Bishop Reuss, who married me, was able in Rome to introduce the what is it called now? The deacons who remain deacons and don't become priests or so, and we have 2 of them here sometimes appearing. In reality, he wanted to cancel celibacy in Rome during the council, and the police, the Vatican police, put him into prison, the poor Bishop Reuss, and because he walked around with a sign against celibacy, and so, but he didn't get the celibacy cancelled, but he got the permanent deacon business. They could be married, so he got at least a little bit something. Okay, that is part of the evolution in which these people were involved. Okay, anything, any question about any of these figures, or because I don't want to talk all the time. We want to have this to be a discourse as much as possible. Okay, do we have any questions? Okay, you have it here. So who was he? What was the political and historical context in which he lived and worked? We want to explore when, where, and why he wrote the Utopia. What is it? So just a word to this. The Utopia was written in Holland. He traveled to Holland in order to promote the wool business between England and Holland. And so there were all kinds of negotiations with businessmen in Holland, and for a long time you had to sit there and had nothing to do. And so during this time then he conceived of the Utopia and wrote this book. The Utopia presents to a particular society what it ought to be versus what it actually is. We want to compare More's political and historical context with our own. What is our present economic and political situation? Thomas can only help if there is some similarity, connection and similarity between his and our historical and political context to a little bit more. David, do you have something?
Yeah, this we started off, excuse me, about the only functionalistic statement in the New Testament.
Right. By their fruits you will know them.
Yeah, by their fruits you will know them. Where does our church? I mean, I think our church should be a little bit more vocal, or present.
Yeah.
Bring it up, perhaps sometimes in the homily, or to the rest of the congregation, the rest of our parishioners, about where does our church stand with? Do we stand by St. Thomas, or do we stand by someone else?
You know, Thomas More was tremendously critical of the church, of the priests and how they behaved, and how the priests were connected to the state and to money and so on. So the Utopia is also full of anti-clerical type of statements. But the problem was that the church and the state, and the church and civil society were too much united, that they were not separated enough, and that the church had completely lost its critical ability. So, and this is a similarity between us, because we do not have enough people. I mean, we had that sexual trouble there in the church, you know, but the main thing would be when the Pope came here and shook the hands of the president and so on, which must have given a sign to everybody, that church and government here, that it is all right, you know, between the two and so on. So a completely uncritical relationship between the two. And that happens while this war was going on, which the Pope had condemned. Both last popes had condemned both Iraqi wars, and then he goes and shakes hands with them. After the war, in Germany, we discussed a long time if one should ever shake the hands of a politician which are bloody, you know, who has made his hands bloody, and we thought one should not shake the hands of somebody who has made his hands so bloody. And and this criticism is simply missing. We have it now. By the way, Blackwater, the contract has been cancelled between the American government and Blackwater. That is Sirico, and that is the money which flows into this diocese and so on. It may not flow any longer. So because of the 17, now we know 17 they killed in the streets, Blackwater. Yeah, that affects us here directly. But this cooperation, you know, or thousands of army chaplains or whatever, you know, which yesterday I heard a number about something like 3,000 army chaplains or so in Iraq alone. So this is all, you know, cooperation between the church and that system, and therefore, you know, the church has a hard time, obviously, to repent or to take a critical attitude toward it, you know, and up to the little detail where this church here, other wants to talk about Thomas More because they think, you know, that's farther back and so on, instead of talking about repentance. Okay. Anything else? Any other issue?
Utopia is the only book I've read.
Yeah.
By
Oh, you
Thomas
have read it already?
Oh, I read it a long time
Yeah,
ago.
okay.
Look how old this stuff is.
Very good. Wonderful.
notes
Then
I
you
took.
can tell us.
No, well,
Yeah.
I almost don't remember because I
Yeah.
read it so long ago.
Yeah.
But I was totally impressed with Utopia.
Yeah.
But I don't know most of the rest. Many of the things you said I didn't know at all.
Yeah, good.
But I think he was a marvelous person.
Definitely, yeah.
And this church is named after him, so I think
Exactly.
that's wonderful
Yeah.
too.
It is, yeah.
And I think we should all come to your lectures and learn more about
Right,
him. So.
exactly. Yeah, that's a wonderful. Yeah, that's of course the motivation, right? I mean, it's amazing that it got that name. If you because just a little thing, you know, it took a very long time until Thomas More was canonized, and the reason why that happened was that he married already 3 months after his wife died. So, and the church took that very badly. The church took that as being not very virtuous, and a saint should at least have waited a year or something like that. So 400 years the man was not able to join the altars because of that. And this is amazing because at the same time as Lord Chancellor, he sentenced people from Wycliffe people, who was a predecessor of Luther in England, and they were declared to be heretics, and Thomas More sentenced them to death, and they were burned alive. So one should think, you know, that the church should have hesitated maybe to canonize him because he killed those people. But they hesitated not because of the killing, but because of having married too early after his wife died. He was under pressure. He had 5 children or so, and had a big house, and so he needed somebody to you know, to take care of the family. So that was always his excuse. And she was older, and she was a widow, and he didn't even like her very much. But she was a very wonderful, down-to-earth person. So while he had these big things about taking the oath of supremacy with Henry VIII and so on, she said, well, just do the oath, you know, you have a family, take care of the family. And when he signed, you know, then she was, where does the money come from? You have to need a job, and so on and so on. And even in the tower, she still went there and said, don't do it, just give them their oath and come home and do your things at home. And so that was Alice. Alice was her name, and of course he didn't listen to her. Okay, now maybe another thing, how he got into this problem there with the oath and his own martyrdom and so on. Henry VIII married the wife of his brother who died. The brother had an illness, and they did not know exactly if the brother, because of his illness, had ever consummated the marriage. But they assumed that the marriage had been consummated, and then there was a law that one could not marry one's brother's wife after he was dead. So these regulations have all changed in the meantime or so. But the Pope gave Henry VIII the permission, the dispensation to marry his brother's wife after his death. And now Henry VIII came a second time and wanted to have a divorce. And that the Church was not willing to do. So that is the big trouble. The separation of the Lutherans from Catholicism was a deeply religious thing, namely about the question of justification. How are we justified? By our own works or by the sacrifice of Christ? But the separation of the Anglican Church from Rome was a political thing. It was a thing more of legality than of theology. So now what Henry would say is that if he would not have an heir, and his first wife had male children, but they all died, 3 of them or so, and so therefore he needed a new wife in order to have an heir, because if he wouldn't have an heir, then the dynasty would break down, and then all the civil wars which had been before in England would all break out again. So it was an entirely political affair why he wanted to marry Anna Boleyn, who was a lady in his court with whom he had fallen in love. So that was the whole issue. And so he engaged Cardinal Wolsey to deal with Rome, and Cardinal Wolsey did not get through in Rome with his argumentation. Rome, the Pope, did not listen to Wolsey, and that made, of course, Henry VIII angry, and Wolsey died then, and Thomas More took his place as Lord Chancellor. So this is the background. Now when you compare this, in Germany they had a similar problem. The Prince of Hessen wanted to marry a second time, and Luther would say, well, you know, human nature is rotten anyway, so we are saved and we are sinners at the same time. So he gave permission to the Prince of Hessen to, as it was called at that time, have bigamy. That means to have a second marriage. So the Protestants dealt with this thing differently than Rome did. So Rome remained stubborn, and the paradox thing is that means they really held on to the New Testament. The charge was always that the Church didn't listen to the New Testament, but in that point at least, the Church did listen to the New Testament. So Jesus had made statements that against divorce. So it was somehow to divorce a woman for Jesus, the Rabbi Jesus, meant to make her an adulteress. And to marry a divorced person would mean to live in adultery. And so these are the statements. Jesus followed some Jewish tradition. There were some rabbis, but a minority, who would say the same thing. So we have that discourse of Jesus with the Pharisees, where they said, Moses allowed us to divorce our wives, to give him a divorce letter, and Jesus would say, yes, you're right, he did this, but why did he do that? Because of the hardness of your heart. That means because you cannot learn, because you cannot evolve, and therefore Moses did that. But in the beginning it was not that way. In the beginning, the Eternal One created man and woman and made them one. And what God has made one, the state of Michigan has no right to separate, or anybody else. So this is that is the position which the Roman Catholic Church took, and that meant that they lost all of England, and then that meant the North American continent as well. That was the price, and so the Pope put all of England under the interdict. That means